Chapter 1. The Alley. Though summer had not yet come to an end, the Wyoming sun hung low in the sky early that night. From her bedroom window on the third floor, Emma stared longingly for one last trip back to Houston. It had been nearly 10 years since the family moved permanently from Texas, and still Tylersville failed to feel like her true home. The air was too dry, the winters were brutal, and despite all the luxuries of her life up north, there felt increasingly like less and less to do each year she spent here. Back in Houston there was plenty. Their former house, which now served as a summer vacation home, was just a few miles from the zoo. The ocean was only an hour's drive on a normal day. Above all, Emma longed for just one more day sitting inside the open-roofed ballpark, one last reminder of an escape from the reality that enclosed her upcoming freshman year. It didn't matter that the Astros were once again terrible. Not even a switch to the American League last season had helped their chances of making an unlikely postseason run. The Texans would offer no escape either. And though she cared very little for soccer, even an afternoon in the orange seats of the Dynamo gave her some picture of a better life than this. Emma laughed out loud to herself, realizing how pathetic these ideas seemed. Houston was a different world. Who cared about baseball now when she was so very likely to die? Her life was contracted to this place, bound to it just like her parents had been and still were. And if someday, by some God-forsaken miracle, she decided to have children of her own, their lives too would be contracted. She tried to remind herself that freshman squads rarely saw active combat, but she still had 4 years of service to this place before she was eligible to opt out. 4 years. Just get through high school, she thought aloud. Just 4 years, and then head back to Houston. You can go to Rice, and then what? That had been her plan for as long as she could remember. But as time accelerated and she finally stared down the barrel of her next 4 years, an additional 4 years of school looked like a second lifetime away. And what would she do next? History and sports were the only things that made her happy. Barely 5 feet tall, an athlete she could never be, and the only option she could think of with a degree in history was teaching. She hated kids. Her mother had a gift that she certainly did not. Emma was good with people, great even, but the life of a politician was not one she would ever want. Her father had been through it all, and at the top of the Tylersville chain of command, his hair grew grayer and grayer with every passing year. His temper so short, Emma feared even approaching him for help with homework. It had been enough to drive her brother away last year. She considered following in Riley's footsteps and transferring as a freshman too, but already afraid enough of the upcoming change, decided against it. After all, her friends were still here. And it was Margot's voice that snapped her out of reflection. With one last look at the large backyard, she stuffed the last of her belongings in a third suitcase and dragged it down the stairs to meet the others. Echoing throughout the house, her mother and best friend were once again arguing about the latter's choice of outfit. "What's the big deal?" Margot was retorting in a loud but respectful voice. "Andrew's friends dress like this all the time." Turning the corner on the final stair, Emma saw Margot towering over her mother, wearing a white tank top that was nearly transparent and a pair of tight-fitting biker shorts that hardly held what was supposed to be inside. "Maybe in their bedrooms," her mother sighed. "But you are 15, young lady, and if I've told you once, I've told you a billion times. You are not living under my roof dressed like a quick and easy corner pickup." Margot cracked a sly smile. "But I'm not living under your roof anymore, am I?" she said, gesturing to her pile of bags on the kitchen floor. "Don't get smart with me, lady." Emma's mother was a squat woman, no taller than Emma herself, with dark red Cuban hair and a fiery attitude to match, that when opposed with Margot, who stood nearly a foot taller, they appeared equal competition. Emma's socked foot hit the bottom stair, trying to remain as silently as possible, but both women turned immediately in her direction. A look of relief came over her mother's twisted face. "See? Why can't you dress like Emma?" The thinnest of hoodies adorned Emma's shoulders. What little curves she had to show were hidden under a purple pair of loose shorts. Even then she worried her mother would scold her for how much of her thighs were showing. Margot huffed. "Emma's not trying to impress anyone." "And you are?" Margot did not answer. Emma knew she had been developing feelings for their friend Jordan, accelerated by the fact that he and his brother Johnny had been sorted into their squad, which meant that for the next year at least the 4 of them would be living together. Margot looked at Emma for help in the argument, but finding none, aggressively ripped open one of her suitcases and pulled out a white t-shirt and a pair of longer athletic shorts. "Thank you," Emma's mother called as Margot stormed off to the kitchen bathroom. She turned to Emma and threw out an arm for a hug. "I've given that girl the kindest 5 years of her life," she said, shaking her head and sighing protectively. "You look out for her, dear." "As much as I can," Emma claimed. Margot was hard to control, but she supposed if anyone could try, it would have to be her. "How are you doing?" her mother asked, certainly seeing worry behind the facade Emma could build. "Nervous?" she said plainly. Her mother's hug turned into a calm rub on the shoulder. "Don't be," her mother rewarded. "You and your father have practiced enough. There should be no worry about your abilities. Margot's the only one who knows." "Does Xander know?" Her mother shook her head. "I can't imagine he does. Your father made sure the official record shows otherwise, so unless someone behind the scenes knows and spilled it to someone as insignificant as Clark Xander, I doubt anybody beyond this house has any clue." Emma breathed a nervous sigh of relief, then looked around at the empty house. "Is Daddy going to make it back before we leave?" Her mother snorted despairingly. "I don't think so, hon. He's at conference call with the Polish PM and the heads of the first 10. Something about an election situation there. He said he'd try and catch up with you before class on Monday if you keep your weekend free. Maybe church on Sunday?" Emma sighed. She had expected this answer. Very rarely did her father put anything before his job. Before she could linger on her father much longer, the bathroom door opened, and Margot emerged in a far more appropriate outfit. Her eyes already rolled halfway to the back of her head. She threw a lazy thumb up for approval from Emma's mother. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Guerin approved cautiously. A knock on the front door meant it was finally time to go. A pair of suited men from the embassy came to help with their bags and stacked them in the back of a black Escalade waiting in front of the house. Walking them out to the front step, Mrs. Guerin gave Margot a tight hug before turning to Emma and giving her a kiss on the forehead. "I'll tell you the same thing I told your brothers," her mother began. "You can always come home if you need to." Emma faked a smile. "And Riley's never coming home," she thought to herself. Her mother failed to stop a tear from leaving either eye as the last of her nest emptied, though it wasn't until they were halfway down the street that Emma allowed herself a brief sniffle too. Margot looked at her disapprovingly from across the middle seat. "Come on," she said, her French accent popping out for the subtlest moment. "At least allow yourself to have fun tonight." The Escalade continued past the large houses in the neighborhood, most of which were also inhabited by high-ranking government officials. The large blue tower where her father was stationed loomed like a storm cloud as they broke onto a main street and headed west toward downtown. The original heart of Tylersville could easily confuse one for the entrance to Disney World. A coherent mix of colonial and heartland Americana, the town's main street was supposed to reflect the essence of the United States. Though she had never visited any of the other cities, her brother had told her all the others were designed to reflect the same. The British headquarters sat in an enormous medieval castle on an island in Scotland, and apparently the city in Norway made Riley feel like he had died and ascended to Valhalla. The stories she had heard about the others made Emma feel like Tylersville was even less than it was. Surely the embassy could do better than what they had now. The rest of the town's public buildings were on a 10-year renovation and modernization schedule, and yet the heart of the town was always refurbished to the same decor of Eisenhower chic. Just beyond the town square, a large glass front served as the main entrance to the shopping center. The Escalade pulled up inside the small loading area, along with less than a dozen other cars, the hundreds of other freshmen clearly choosing to walk or take the monorail. The two girls exited with Emma turning to the passenger side window, just as the man in front rolled it down to meet her. "Are you sure you don't want us to take our bags?" she asked, almost feeling naked without her belongings. "Don't worry, ma'am," the man said monotonously. "We'll take care of it all. You enjoy your evening." "Thanks," she stuttered as the window lifted and the large black vehicle drove away. "Come on," Margot said, grabbing her hand and pulling her through the doors with a crowd of others. Beyond the doors, a massive atrium fell into a square base below them. Entering from the building's third level, they were surrounded on all sides by 4 floors of shops and stalls, most beginning to shut down for the evening ahead of a busy weekend. On the floor below, a maze of flower beds, hedges, and fountains now stood filled like an ant farm with the dots of congregating students. The usual food court had been cleared on the far end, with the tables now ringing around the outside with signs attached to their fronts, though from far away Emma could not make out their text. The two girls followed the flow of traffic down the nearby escalators before spilling out onto the ground floor. Now closer to the signs, Emma saw each table labeled with a series of 4 numbers, obviously referring to the different squads. Their squad number was 3006, and after a brief scan of the horseshoe of tables, Margot spotted their table in the back left corner of the floor. Clark Xander was standing behind it, reading through a large packet of forms in a folder labeled with the same number. Beside him was a girl, halfway between the height of Emma and Margot, with bushy brown hair and outfitted from head to toe in black, including her heavy eyeliner and a series of bands on either wrist. Her caramel skin was darker than even Emma's, though hers looked more genetic than tanned. Xander spotted the girls approaching and gave them each a brief side hug when they approached the table. "Girls, welcome," he smiled. "This is Liz." He gestured to the girl, who was only now looking up anxiously from her phone. "Liz, this is—" he began. "Well, I might as well let you two do the honors." Emma stuck out her hand. Margot did the same. "Emma Guerin. Margot Drier." Liz stuck out her own hand cautiously. "Liz Granhook," she said before staring at Margot, caught up on the pronunciation of her last name. Almost comforted by her realization, she breathed, "You're not American." "Neither are you," Margot addressed before explaining herself. "Laval, Quebec. That's in Canada, but I've been here for 5 years." Seeing the inquisitive look on Liz's face, Margot added, "It's a long story." "You're from England," Emma stated plainly. Cambridge, yeah," Liz stuttered. "But you're still a freshman." "That's what you lot call it, yeah," she replied. Emma looked at Margot, knowing they'd both wondered her following question. "So why'd you transfer?" Liz looked taken aback by the question, staring at her feet before catching a breath to explain. "It's a long story," she repeated, with a look at Xander that told Emma she wanted to explain herself even less than Margot did. Luckily, Xander's head popped up again to alleviate this sudden tension. "Boys!" he shouted. The girls turned to join his attention. Johnny and Jordan were making their way through the conglomeration of bodies at the edge of the nearest fountain. The focus of Margot's attention was the taller of the two. Dressed in a gray t-shirt and tan shorts, Jordan stood at a threatening height well above 6 feet. Thin and sinewy, with short blonde hair that was peppered with flakes of brown and black, a look he had always sported and claimed it was the result of a genetic disorder. Even more striking than his height and hair, however, was his left eye. The result of an accident in his youth, a long webbed scar stemmed from a half-closed but completely blind eyeball. The other eye, operational despite its appearance, was a striking transparent gray. His brother walked beside him, much less imposing. Though he held himself with a bold posture and had a more muscular build, Johnny was shorter than Margot, and standing next to the far taller Jordan, he was almost invisible. His hair, still short, though longer than his brother, was a darker blonde, almost red in color. His face was spotted with such insignificant freckles you could only really see them up close. The pair approached the group and shook hands with Xander, awkwardly looking at the girls and deeming their normal conversation inappropriate beside the two outsiders. They introduced themselves to Liz, who retorted the same, Johnny quick to hop on her accent. "Margot's foreign too," Jordan jabbed, before getting the hint from all three girls that this was already trodden territory. "Where's the other guy?" Johnny questioned Xander, alluding to their missing 6th and final squad mate. "He should be here any minute," Xander asserted. "Kenton, right?" Emma asked aloud, knowing the answer already. Since their rosters and schedules had been released that Monday, she did as much research on the others as she could. Xander nodded. Though not saying any more, Emma deduced that he, like the rest of them, had yet to meet the other boy. Liz was already back on her phone, stepping aside from the rest of them, while Xander went back to his folder, perhaps making sure they were still expecting another member. "We met him, I think," Jordan said. "In the big house. He's been staying there for the last month with a handful of outsiders." "What's he like?" Emma questioned, curious of the dynamic of the new group. With the way Liz was avoiding them, it seemed easy for them to continue their usual foursome without interference. "Couldn't tell," said Jordan. "He came in blind, though, completely blind, like his mom sprung it on him around Christmas last year. Had never even heard of the place before arriving, so expect a ton of questions." "His parents didn't come with?" Margot replied curiously. "I don't know if he has any. Guessing something's off if he's been living at the big house." The organization had no better word for non-residents than outsiders. It was typical of 2 of every 3 residents to leave the city after their service period, some having kids with non-members, though it was always the requirement for these kids to serve their own period by the time they hit high school. Most parents were smart enough to move back to Tylersville well in advance of this, to give a sort of grace period, to adjust to the city and the society within the organization. But some people, as was apparently the case for this new boy, came in at the last possible moment. For years, Emma had tried to imagine how surprising that must be. Her speculation was cut short by a soft voice interrupting their bubble. "Hi," the voice said. "This is 3006, right?" Emma turned around to find a boy dressed in a black t-shirt and jeans, taller than Margot but still in the shadow of Jordan, next to whom he was now stood. She tried very hard to think of him beyond an Italian stereotype, though with his olive skin and hooked nose, he certainly fit the picture. His shiny dark brown hair was parted down the middle and tucked neatly behind his ears. A leather-strapped watch sat alone on his left wrist. His head was tucked forward in an unconfident posture. He closed his mouth and twitched it up on one side to offer a confused smile. "Don't say it like that," Jordan sighed disapprovingly. "Don't make it sound cooler than it is. We're not spies." "Yeah, we could be," pondered Johnny. "Any leads on missions yet?" "A few, potentially," said Xander. "But let's get inside before I spill anything, now that we're all here. Why don't you introduce yourselves?" "Kent Delvecchio." The boy offered his hand limply to the boys first. "Jordan Delarue. Johnny Sparks." "Come on," Kent hesitated. "Sparks? That sounds like you made it up." "Jonathan Franklin Sparks," Johnny defended. "Born and raised." He turned next to Liz, and for the 3rd time they repeated the routine surrounding her accent. He shook Xander's hand and then finally moved to the girls, turning slightly red as boys often did when face to face with Margot, then lastly to Emma. Introductions aside, they followed Xander to the opposite wall of the mall, through which was the entrance to the city's bowling alley. 100 lanes spread out in a fan from the center, the lights dark except below the luminescent lanes, the music blaring loud enough for them to raise their voices once inside. Outfitted with shoes and balls, the seven found themselves stationed near the middle of the pack, and despite disinterest from Liz, Xander entered all their names, excluding himself, into the system to play a single game. He then passed around a menu and jotted their orders into a note on his phone before leaving them to their own devices and serving as the squad's waiter. With Liz using the shortened form of her name, Emma was alphabetically first in their order, and not wanting to start on a negative impression, took a deep breath and drilled the right of the front pin to begin on a perfect strike. The group behind her applauded casually, though Kent gave a little extra emphasis as though trying to stand out. She casually bowed and took a seat at the table with the rest of them, while Johnny stood up to go next. "Your last name's Guerin?" Kent stared enthusiastically as Emma worked herself comfortable in the plastic chair. "Yes, sir," she replied, looking up at the board to make sure it entered her shot correctly. "The mayor guy," Kent continued. "His last name's Guerin. I'm guessing you're related." Jordan shot the boy a contemptuous look. If by mayor guy you mean the prime minister, then yeah," Emma answered. "He's my dad." "Why don't you just call him the president?" "Because of all the ministers, he's the primary one," Jordan interjected before standing up to take his turn. Johnny had split his 2 throws in half for a spare. "It's not a democracy, it's a corporate oligarchy," Emma explained. "Each department has an internally elected minister, and the set of ministers vote amongst themselves for a regional leader. That becomes the PM." Kent seemed to follow, though Emma worried her answer had sparked more questions. She had never met an outsider so green to the program he couldn't ask his parents. "So which department was your dad in before?" the boy asked in turn. "Well, he was deputy PM when I was born," she explained. "You're eligible for the ticket as second in command. It's like vice president, so he never actually served as the head of the ministry, but prior to that he was in foreign affairs." Jordan missed the final pin on an 8-ball spare and returned to sit next to Margot. He gestured to Kent that it was now his turn. Nervously walking to the rack, it was evident that he had not frequented bowling alleys prior to his arrival in Tylersville. His first shot managed to find a pair of pins on the very far left, while the second careened well wide into the right gutter. He spun around slowly, apparently looking for some kind of approval or comfort from the rest of them, which Emma found Margot providing. "We're not judging you on your bowling skills," she voiced. "I am." Jordan shrugged malevolently, receiving a nudge in the ribs from Margot as a result. Kent turned slightly red in the face and sat back down at the table. "You're up," Jordan continued, nudging Liz, who was again focused on her phone. No thanks," she replied blankly, her eyes barely lifting. The remaining 5 of them stared around at one another before Emma urged her again. "The rest of us are bowling," she said as calmly and firmly as she could mix. "You should too." "I don't want to," Liz answered again, returning desperately to the safety of her screen. "Yeah, well, I don't want to spend half of high school training for missions, but here we are," Jordan bullied, garnering short laughs from Johnny and Margot. "Come on." Realizing Jordan was going to stand up and drag her over to the lane, Liz simply stood up in a huff, stepped back so she had a clear line toward the pins, and thrust her right wrist forward. A purple ball of energy ripped from the base of her hand and hurtled down the lane far faster than a bowling ball. Dissipating on impact, it struck the front pin with such force the entire set of 10 bounced off the back wall before falling onto the conveyor. A single pin bounced back into the lane and spun like a bottle. With another flick of her wrist, Liz sent this to the conveyor with a smaller ball of light. Several lanes in either direction stopped dead in response. Finally, Sidney Salzer broke the silence with a loud cheer from 3 lanes to their left. The nearby tables erupting in approval, Liz turned back to the squad and pulled the same sarcastic bow as Emma had before. She sat back down and, instead of returning to her phone, waited for a response from the rest of them. Jordan blinked loudly. "Holy shit," he breathed, clearly taken aback. Johnny shot him a look for swearing. Kent was nearly jumping out of his seat. "Is that your radiation effect?" he shouted eagerly. Liz laughed. For the first time, Emma saw more than her crooked front teeth. "If it's not, I'd hate to know what is." Margot stood up to take her turn. Before she took a step, Kent stopped her. "What's yours?" he asked. Emma knew exactly what Margot was about to do. A trick she had shown off 100 times before, Margot held up both of her hands to the group, backs toward them. Kent seemed to only now realize that the silver tips of her fingers were not, in fact, covered in polish, but that her very nails were metallic, and they slowly began to grow outwards until each was nearly 2 inches long. Kent caught his breath. "Jesus," he whispered. At the same time, Emma and Johnny said, "Don't say that." Kent perked up, confused by their tandem speech. What? Don't say Jesus, Johnny reiterated before Emma could join him. Kent seemed taken aback by the concept. He looked at Emma, who glared the same as Johnny and Jordan. Wait, Kent cycled. So he can say holy shit, but I can't say Jesus. I prefer you say neither, Johnny stated. Both of you. Kent was shocked into silence. Emma wasn't sure he expected Johnny to speak against him like this. Jordan gave his brother a tilted shrug and apology. Struggling to find a response, Kent was only able to say, "What's yours?" Johnny's attitude flipped on a dime. "My what?" he said. "My effect?" Kent nodded. Johnny took a conceited breath. "Kenton Vincenzo Del Vecchio," he began imposingly. "Born August 15th, 1999 in Brooklyn, New York, to Elanio Del Vecchio and Dalton Hawk. Physically based radiation effect. Has the ability to run speeds 2 to 3 times faster than normal for body size and shape. Mother graduated from Truman High in 1994. Immediate opt-out. Maternal grandparents deceased. Limited contact with paternal relations. No siblings connected to the International Radiation Effect Association. Last known address, 816 55th Street, Brooklyn, New York." Johnny stared at Kent, who seemed taken aback at the information just relayed to the group. He stuttered for a moment, trying to find a response. His face grew red, finally voicing, "Are you trying to intimidate?" But Johnny interrupted him. Those who knew Johnny were aware of exactly what he was doing. Completely ignoring Kent, he turned his attention to Emma, who waited, prepared for her own immediate details to be read aloud. "Emmeline Guerin, born May 20th, 2000 in Houston, Texas, to Bill and Wendy Guerin. Physically based radiation effect. Has the ability to hit a target of any type with near-perfect accuracy. Father graduated from Truman High in 1985. Mother is not a member of the International Radiation Effect Association. 2 older brothers. Eldest, biological, Andrew Joshua Guerin, currently a senior at Truman High. Second elder, adopted, Riley Emmanuel Guerin, currently a sophomore stationed in Monteverdi, Italy." Johnny paused and turned his attention to Liz, who held up a hand to stop him. Having seemingly caught on to Johnny's demonstration, she calmly requested, "Please don't do me." Johnny held his breath and turned contently back to Kent, who still didn't seem to understand what Johnny was doing. "So you've memorized our basic info," he scowled. "So what?" Jordan rolled his eyes. "Catch up, speedster," he teased. "That's what he does. He memorizes things." Kent's brow furrowed, trying to understand. "What, like everything?" "Everything," the 4 locals said in unison. "Since when?" Kent questioned in disbelief. "When was the seizure, John?" Jordan directed. "April 10th, 2012, Johnny repeated in kind. Kent looked eager to keep asking questions, but Xander finally returned to the table with a tray filled with smaller red fast food baskets. Despite the 6 of them holding up their hands when he passed out the meals, he kept checking his notes to make sure they were handed to the correct recipients. "So," he sighed, joining them at the end of the table. "What'd I miss?" Kent was first to acknowledge their showcase, to which he added, "What's yours?" toward Xander. "Me?" Xander laughed, taken by slight surprise. "Mine's long gone." Again, Kent was confused by the answer, and again Jordan rolled his eyes before responding. "You really expect these to last forever," he said. "When did you get yours, 12? 13? Kent stuttered. I think I was 11 when I discovered it." Xander took a long drag from his straw to wash down the series of fries in his mouth. 10 years on average," he choked. "You'll get the rare case where it lasts your entire life, but those are almost always mentally based, like Johnny's. Come to think of it, I can't think of a single case otherwise that lasted more than 20. A few dozen times, an effect hasn't shown up until way later in life when the service period has long since elapsed." Emma shuddered at the thought of her effect creeping up in her 40s. "Almost always, though, if it doesn't develop by the time you hit high school, it never shows up at all," he continued. Margot shot Emma a brief glance before quickly turning back to Xander. "What do you guys call them in England?" he turned, asking Liz. "Jumpers," she stated. "Me mum is one." "Here we typically refer to them as skips," Xander kept on. "Still have the same privileges with the company, especially later in life. Everyone is mostly on equal standing once the powers disappear, even non-members, but I certainly don't envy skips during their service years." Kent looked around, realizing he was the only one in the group unaware of this. "So, do they still get sorted into squads?" Xander had just stuffed his mouth full of fries again. "Absolutely," he muffled, quickly washing down the food. "Anyone can hold a gun, anyone can be a field medic, anyone can learn a second language. Certain things don't come nearly as easy, but it's still part of the genetic contract. They're still carriers of the effect gene, and 2 skips have never been reported in back-to-back generations." Kent nodded. "That's why they're called skips." "Exactly," Xander affirmed. "You'll learn all of this in your science and history classes." But Kent looked around at the rest of them with a jealous, almost embarrassed look, acutely aware of how out of place he sat amongst the squad as the sole outsider. Realizing it was her turn and had been for several minutes, Emma stood up and took her turn, another strike. Kent looked ready to ask another question, and saving him from the embarrassment, answered first. "That's my demonstration," she said smugly. Johnny stood up to go next. "Show us yours," Jordan said, and Emma realized he had placed his arm around Margot's shoulder. She was blushing. Kent stuttered. Emma realized his discomfort and grabbed her phone off the table while no one was looking. Kent began, looking around the alley. "You already read my bio. There's not a ton of space in here to show you. Tell him to back off," Emma texted Margot, sensing Kent's growing shyness in front of Jordan. Margot's phone buzzed on the table. She showed it quickly to Jordan, who gave Emma the same apologetic smile he gave Johnny before. "Fair enough," Jordan conceded. "Tomorrow in gym, let's see it." Kent seemed to think this was a fair deal. "All right," he said comfortably. "How about you?" Without skipping a beat, prepared beyond any of them, Jordan closed his eyes. "The squad behind me is missing 2 members," he began. "One is in the bathroom, one left to the courtyard to make a phone call. The boy in the opposite middle seat just stood up to take his turn. He just picked up a ball. He just set it back down. It was the wrong weight. The last person's ball is going to pop out from the floor in 3, 2, 1. The rest of them watched as every single one of Jordan's narrations happened in real time. When the ball popped out at his exact count, he opened his eyes again and smiled confidently at Kent. "I can't see with this," he said, pointing at his dead eye, then holding up his hands. "So I see with these." With the final demonstration complete, Kent held his tongue for the remainder of their game. Though the others came nowhere close to Emma's perfect game, there was a steady competition for second between Johnny and Margot, and even Liz seemed to be enjoying herself after joining the game, despite being well behind Kent and dead last. Nearing the 9th frame, Johnny once again brought up the question of missions. "The council seems really impressed with all of you," Xander explained. "Together, specifically, they think your effects complement each other nicely, and they're eager to see how well you mesh in the first few weeks of training. Bar any setbacks, they're tempted to throw something difficult your way early on in the school year." Emma's stomach churned. The burger she had finished 4 frames ago was threatening its way back up. "What, like combat?" Margot asked for her. "Nothing suicidal," Xander claimed. "High success simulation so far, but definitely looking to push you as freshmen. You guys should be proud of your skill sets. It's been a long time since a squad as young as you were was being projected this highly in the eyes of the council." Emma's eyes connected with Liz, who looked as white as she felt. "You're not talking firefights," Jordan voiced. "I'm not talking firefights," Xander relayed. "It's a long way off, and it's far from certain, but there's potential we head into an active war zone before the end of the school year." Emma threw up in her mouth. The lights illuminating the lane floors pierced through her closed eyelids as her head began to spin. "My father promised this wouldn't happen," she thought hard to herself. "He promised. Something must have been mishandled at the embassy." She tried hard to convince herself that Xander hadn't really just said what she thought he had, but his voice kept repeating the phrase active war zone between her ears. She could feel herself swaying, and suddenly switched her focus to trying not to pass out at the idea. The loud music from the speakers above the table were booming, and the words quickly turned to ringing. The light in her eyes was turning white, engulfing everything. Her face felt hot. Her hands felt limp at her side. Suddenly, she felt something tight grip her right hand. "It'll be all right," a voice whispered in her ear. "He said potential, it's not for sure." The senses rushed back to Emma's head. It was Johnny, who she realized was holding her hand firmly in his own. She looked around mortified, hoping the others hadn't seen her nearly pass out in front of them, and to her relief, the attention was instead on Liz, who was having a panic attack of her own, with Xander convincing her that per the terms of some deal with the embassy in Britain, she specifically would be the last to see direct combat. Missing the initial context, Emma was somewhat relieved to hear that someone else in the group was being granted special privileges. If her biggest fear during the service years was staring death in the face, her second biggest fear was receiving special treatment on behalf of her father. "Somewhere in the middle," she prayed silently. "Why can't we just dig wells in Africa?" Her brother Riley had hit the jackpot in terms of easy work for the company. Alongside his girlfriend, they had transferred from Australia to Italy in July, and were set to spend at least the entire semester doing nothing but studying affected DNA as their missions work. From the sound of Xander's eagerness to start training, their squad would have it a bit more difficult. Hardly paying attention, the terms Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South America were being tossed around between the others still listening, and only then did Emma realize her hand was still interlocked with Johnny's. She looked at him, and realizing it himself, he pulled away quickly. Emma hoped Margot hadn't seen. She'd never let her live it down if she had. When her turn came around for the final time, Emma realized she was shaking too hard to complete the perfect game. Leaving the others in shocked surprise, she threw the 13th ball directly into the gutter, turned around to stunned faces, and shrugged. "Too easy," she said, returning to the table where Kent's mouth remained dropped in disbelief. The final score was still far from close. Among the last to leave the previously crowded alley despite their single game, the 7 filled out of the deserted shopping center as the sun was just dropping below the butte-filled horizon. A few other squads joined them in an otherwise empty train car. A single stop later, the monorail pulled into the station halfway between the school and the residential center. Over 20 stories high and built from striking white stone, the residential center was the base of operations for the 1,000-plus students of Truman High. Emma had only been once before to visit her brother Andrew on the occasion of his 15th birthday. As the squad common areas were exclusive to squad members, with supposedly zero exception, she had never seen the inside rooms, though the catalog from which she had picked her private decor gave her a good enough idea. Through the rotating front door, their ears were met by the shouts and screams of 100 high schoolers, shoving and splashing in the large swimming pool that served as the building's community floor. Surrounded on all sides like the shopping center by a large atrium, the dozens of floors above them were ringed by open hallways and windows. Xander led them to the nearest set of elevators and passed out key cards before pressing the number 15. Arriving there, the sounds of the pool now echoed around them from far below. An open walkway circled the open atrium on all sides. On the wall opposite, a series of frosted glass doors counted upward from 3,000. They followed Xander to the 7th door, boldly labeled with their squad number. He held up his own keycard to the white reader near the right side handle. The pad flashed green, and the manual clicking sound of an unlocking door was followed by Xander opening the door and letting them inside. Just beyond a small entry corner, their new home spread out before them in the form of a large single room, split nearly down the middle by 2 different floors. On the far side, a carpeted gray living room was headlined by a large flat-screen TV mounted between a set of vertical speakers. Sitting below atop a set of black wooden cabinets was Jordan's Xbox. On the near wall, a small series of asymmetrical shelves held empty picture frames, presumably to hold future memories of the 6 of them, which had yet to be made. All of this was circled by 2 black leather chairs and a matching 3-person couch, which fit snugly in the space around a glass coffee table. In the nearer half, the floor was a fake vinyl wood. The same black wooden cabinets also adorned this side, though in the form of a small kitchen, topped by white countertops. A large sink sat in one corner of a detached island, which was surrounded by matching black bar stools. Beyond this room, an open hallway played host to 4 doors, matched in sets of 2s like a hotel. To the hallway's far left, tucking behind the kitchen and above the doorway, a staircase led to a small landing, half the size of the common area below, hosting 2 large sitting chairs outside the remaining 2 bedrooms. Each room was labeled, and as their belongings had been delivered by embassy staff rather than themselves, Emma and Margot were apparently the only ones who had not yet seen their own rooms. Eager to do so, and with nothing pressing on the schedule for the rest of the night, Xander handed out large packets which appeared to match his own folder, told them to expect him in the morning for an 11 o'clock meeting, and wished them all good night. Almost immediately, Liz disappeared up the stairs. Kent, who still appeared to have a million questions, peered around the kitchen before checking the fully stocked fridge. He was amazed to find a blank list on its side, which Margot explained was for them to fill out any time they ran out of certain things on their grocery list, to then be filled and restocked by building staff along with things like laundry. Amused by Kent's amazement, Emma reclused herself to her bedroom, eager to see how closely it matched the catalog. The final door on the right, just next to Margot's, she opened the locked door with her same keycard and found the room painted a calm crimson, just as she had requested. The light brown drawers were as close as she could possibly get to matching her bedroom in Houston, and even the bathroom tiling was the same white and teal stoning she had written down on the form. To her horror, she found her bags already unpacked, and realized that one of the men from the embassy must have gone through and placed her refolded underwear in the drawers. With a bit of relief, she found them in a drawer different from where they sat at the palace, and she suddenly felt less like a lab rat. Even security cameras were outlawed in the city outside of testing facilities, and yet for the last month, increasingly today, Emma had felt the subject of a massive experiment. And yet her underwear in the wrong drawer gave her some sense of peace. 10 minutes later, her clothes resorted to the correct places, she finished off the last of her personal decorations with the large flag of Texas she had taken from their flagpole in Houston, flipped it vertically, and hung its center over her bed. She smiled in finality, though her moment of admiration was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Johnny. "Hey," she said, inviting him in. Kent was still outside in the kitchen. She shut the door behind them. "How are you?" he asked, his eyes moving to the framed picture of her and Riley sitting atop the set of drawers. "Fine, I think," she lied. Despite looking away from her, Johnny seemed to sense her dishonesty. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "We all are." "Yeah," she found herself saying, before keeping her mouth from continuing. "At least you have an advantage." "Jordan, too," he said. "Swagger and all, he cried himself to sleep last night." Emma laughed aloud. He did not cry himself to sleep last night. He got pretty close. Johnny smiled before his face soured. He's probably thinking about his mom more than anything. Emma gloomed with him. Any word? Nothing, he sighed. Last sight of the caravan was 4 weeks ago. Emma's heart pulled. Shoot, I'm sorry, John. What are you going to do? He said sullenly. Mine are already dead. I know how to deal with it. She still raised you, Emma tried to comfort. Yeah? He chuckled unconvincingly. And what's one more? Stop it, she growled. Don't ever say that. He looked back at her pictures, to the one featuring her mother and Margot. Does Margot ever miss hers? He asked. Emma paused. I'm sure she does, she admitted. But her situation is a lot different. I suppose, Johnny agreed, turning back to face her. They all made it through. Why can't we? Emma smiled. It was exactly what she needed to hear. You know my dad never lost a single squad mate in his entire 4? Johnny grinned in return. He was in the trenches too, wasn't he? He recalled. If this was the military, he'd qualify for about 15 Purple Hearts, she claimed. No one was ever even hit. Johnny's smile grew wider. So why not us, eh? Emma felt tears coming to her eyes. The night she had been dreaded for over a year was finally here. Why not us? She repeated. Johnny stuck out his fist for her to knock it. No, she declined, putting her arms around his middle and hugging her friend as tightly as she could. Thank you for earlier. I needed that. She pulled away and smiled up at him. That's what I'm here for, he said. He walked to the door and turned the handle. Night, Emma. She grinned. Night, John. He walked through the frosted door beyond which she could see nor hear a thing, and as soon as the door closed, Emma felt all the light in the world leave her once again, the sense of impending dread creeping toward her from all corners of her new bedroom. 4 years, she tried to convince herself. It's just 4 years. Shutting off the light and crawling into bed, she found herself facing the same worrying truth that had plagued her nightmares for weeks. Despite the squad, despite her family, despite Jordan, Margot, and even Johnny, in this new environment, Emma Guerin was now completely and utterly alone.